Hey guys, yesterday I made a comment about using a tritone gradient map on an image. If you're familiar with the gradient, normally it has two colors and it'll just fade from, the dark color across to the light color or vice versa. You can apply a gradient map to an image where it takes your darkest tones and it'll put what's over on the left as your darkest tone and whatever on the right is your lightest tone, and then it just kind of fades in between. So if I go to Image, Adjustment, Gradient Map, it's using this black to white gradient. It's making the darkest pixels pure black, it's making the lightest pixels pure white, and then it's just transitioning from black to white across the tonal values in the image. If you just use a two-tone gradient map, it can cause problems. Number one, my dark areas are way darker than I would like them to be, and her skin, which is a mid-tone, is darker than I would like it to be. The highlights are fine. But while you have this gradient map dialog box open, if you simply click anywhere in the actual gradient, it brings up your gradient editor. If you open these files, there are different gradients that you can choose from and apply to an image. And all it's doing is taking the one color or the two colors or the three colors or however many colors are in the samples, and it's mapping that across the image. Of course, that looks crazy on a photograph. But our just standard black to white, which is what we start with, if I come down here to this section of, I can click anywhere below the line, it creates a new point. So now I have 1, 2, 3 points of my gradient. I don't want this middle point to be black. I want it to be more of a middle gray. So I come down to the color box and click it. And if I pick a middle gray color, I now am using a tritone gradient. I'm using black to gray to white. Looks a lot better. Now that I've got a 3-color gradient set up in this panel right here, there's a couple things you can do. I can change this middle color by simply clicking over here in the color panel, and as I make that middle color brighter and darker, look at the effect it has on the midtones. So I normally get it to where I think that looks nice to me. Now there's a second thing you can do. You can actually click and drag this middle slider. You have to come out of your color box. I can move this slider over, and it's changing how the pixels are being mapped from black to gray and from gray to white, depending upon where this middle slider is. Whoop, I accidentally grabbed. Alright, I accidentally added an extra one. If you do that, if you just pull it off, like you can pull it off if you've made a mistake. So you make a new one. Alright. So if I push it to the left, it's going to lighten the darker tones. If I move it to the right, it's going to darken the middle tones. But also, once you kind of get it to where you go, hey, that looks good to me, you can also, this is like a midway transition point, you can grab this little diamond and move it. So now I'm only adjusting the gradient between black and gray, kind of as a sub adjustment. And you'll notice my little diamond went away between gray and white. If I just click on gray, the diamond comes back, and now I can move it. So I can subtly adjust the gradient between gray and white. And what that allows is for maximum tonal range adjustment on your image. If you wanted to, you can actually add yet another point here, make it an even lighter shade of gray, and you can fade it back and forth to really target specific tones, in a specific area. But when I said yesterday I was using a tri-tone gradient, it's because I'm using black, gray, white, that's 3 tones, and then I'm fading them back and forth. So if you get a gradient laid out the way you like, you can click New. It will save that. You tell it OK. The other thing you can do once you've made an image black and white is sometimes it's fun. You can overlay that on top of your color image that is down beneath by just trying like soft light. And so it changes the contrast of the image, and you can play with the opacity like that. Okay, so out of this image, this is Vivi's image. If I were to duplicate it and go Image, Adjustment, Gradient Map, it's just mapping from black to white. That is way too severe. It needs more light in the midtones. So I click on in this area. It brings up the gradient editor. If I scroll to the bottom of all these presets, there are different gradient maps. That's the one I saved last time. I can try applying it. You can see that here's my black, my gray, and my white. And I can do the same thing where I move these sliders around, and that helps adjust the image. And again, if the little diamond here is missing, if you just click one or the other, your little diamond comes back. I don't know why it disappears. It just does. But now, if I'm just sliding this little middle diamond, I'm adjusting the gradient between the black and the gray. It's not affecting from gray to white. And so I can play with my shadow intensity over here. And if I click here and my little diamond comes back, I can play with where the transition occurs between gray and white. And you'll notice he had this hot spot on his forehead. If this is over in the middle, that hot spot is way too bright. And so by pulling it over a little bit, it helps knock that highlight down. So if you tell it OK and OK, here's the difference between how it was and how it is. And then of course if you wanted to, you can play with the opacity to get the kind of the perfect black and white. Now some smart cookie is going to say, can't I put a gradient map adjustment layer over the top? And the answer is absolutely. If you just click on the split circle and you go to gradient map over here, same thing, a two-tone gradient map. That's too severe, so I click in here, brings up my gradient editor, I click underneath, change my middle point to a gray tone, just like before. Then I move the little, I call it a diamond, I move it over and start playing with it, start pulling some lightness out. Whoop. It's real touchy. Sometimes you're trying to drag that little diamond and you end up creating a new point. And again, if you accidentally create an extra point you don't want, just click down and pull away and it'll disappear. So again, I can just move this over. And again, I can play with how gray are my middle tones by picking here and here. And then same thing, I can move this little diamond way far to the left. That means the darkest darks are only in the darkest parts of the image. So there I accidentally added a point, so I just drag it off. So a tritone gradient is 1, 2, 3 tones laid over the top. And then the same thing, you can play with the opacity to get it right where you want it. The one advantage of doing it as an adjustment layer is you can, once you've come out of the gradient editing, if I come back and click here, it'll come right back to where I was. So it's non-destructive. The other way is once you've imposed it, you either have to start over or whatever. Alright, so last but not least, just as a bonus, if you have a color image, so here I have a color image, and a lot of times people want to put some blues in the shadows and some orange in the highlights. If you duplicate the layer, come up to your gradient map, image, adjustment, gradient map, and for my colors I want a blue tone in the shadows, I want a gray tone in the midtones, and I want a orange tone in my highlights. So it's going from a darker blue to medium gray to orange. I'm gonna make that a little more blue. A little more blue. Maybe like that. Okay. So I've got a tritone gradient that's blue, gray to orange. One of the things we know about soft light is gray doesn't really do anything. On a soft light layer, it has to be brighter than gray or darker than gray. My color that is brighter than gray is orange. My color that is darker than gray is blue. And so that adds the blue color to the shadows and the orange color to the highlights and leaves the midtones fairly static. And then again, you can fade the result in and out, and it can be really subtle, but it's a way of color grading your images. Or if I wanted to do it a little more severe where you can really see it, if I go to Image Adjust Gradient Map, and let's say I put some dark reds in the shadows, and I put some, I don't know, we'll just so you can see it, some greens in the highlights. When I change that to soft light, I get like a color filtering that affects the shadows and the highlights differently, and then as always I can fade that in and out. Last but not least, since I have two colors on this top layer, if I go Image Adjustment, Hue and Saturation, and I'm rotating both of those hues around the color wheel. So one gradient that's been applied can be adjusted to a number of different things. So I'm going to get rid of this layer. So let's say I go Image, Adjustment, Gradient Map, and I pick two colors that are opposite of each other. I put blue in the shadows, and let's say I put, what's the opposite of blue? The opposite of blue is yellow. I put some yellow in the highlights. When I tell it OK, I have a blue to yellow gradient sitting on top. But if I go to Image, Adjustment, Hue and Saturation, it's going to rotate both of those colors around the color wheel. And since I set them up as opposite colors, they're always complementary opposing colors. So then when I change it to soft light, which then tones what's underneath, as I go to Image Adjustment, Hue and Saturation, I'm rotating those two colors around the color wheel, and sometimes you can find like a real pleasing balance as you go around and around. You can play with the saturation, and you can fade that in and out to taste, and it works like a two-tone color filter. Anyway, try it.